Conservation Efforts Database webinar. My name is Leif Wickman with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is the second webinar in a 3-webinar series developed for the Nevada Collaborative Conservation Network. These webinars are intended to capture the content and conversation that took place in an in-person workshop in Reno on April 18th, 2019. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, we weren't able to use the recording from that workshop, and so we've summarized it here. Before I get underway, I'd like to again acknowledge Justin Welty with the USGS in Boise and Matt Heller with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Bozeman, 2 members of the Conservation Efforts Database team that helped provide content for this presentation. So with that, we'll get underway. Again, to remind everyone, if you didn't listen to the first webinar, the goals of this workshop are to kind of provide overview of what the CED is, what it can do, and how it can provide utility and benefit for you and your agency or organization. Looking at the entire outline for all 3 talks, in the first webinar I provided an overview and a history of the CED, as well as a background on the features, what the purpose of the tool is, how the data is used, and went through some high-level overview of our collection and reporting features, and lastly talked about some updates to the system. In this second installation, we'll be talking more about the organization of the CED, taking a deeper dive into the threat-based structure, and then we'll go more into data collection. So, just a real brief overview of what we covered in the first webinar. The Conservation Efforts Database was initially established to support the 2015 Greater Sage-Grouse Status Review. Since then, we've kind of expanded our scope, and while we'll still provide support for species status assessments, we'd also like to assist all of our partners, federal, state, NGO, with tracking and reporting on conservation actions, essentially creating a common currency when data is coming in from a number of various sources in a number of different formats. In order to do this, we chose to start looking at what are the threats, what are the impacts driving sagebrush habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. In 2013, an interagency team developed what was called the Conservation Objectives Team Report, or you'll often hear it referred to as the COT report. Again, it was an interagency product aimed at identifying the presence and magnitude of factors impacting sage-grouse habitat quantity and quality. That was our basis for identifying which actions, which conservation actions we were going to collect information on. Now, we continue to work with partners to identify other factors influencing sagebrush habitat quantity and quality, and an example of this would be that we have started to collect information on conservation actions that are aimed at providing conservation or restoration to wet meadows and riparian areas. That was not necessarily identified in the COT report as a threat to sage-grouse, but we understand that those habitats are vital to the sagebrush ecosystem as a whole, and there's a lot of work being done to conserve and restore those areas. So, what are the threats we're talking about? So the COT report identified 13 threats. Agriculture or tillage risk. You'll often see this referred to in the CED as agriculture conversion. We're talking about row crops and things like winter wheat, That is not to be confused with ranching or grazing. Additionally, we collect information on actions that address things like improper grazing, wildfire, ex-urban development or subdivision, urban expansion, sagebrush removal, recreation, and a number of other things. I touched on this in the first webinar. We collect information in three different ways, three different types: spatial, semi-spatial, and non-spatial, predominantly for plans and strategies. Now, the difference between spatial and semi-spatial is somewhat nuanced, but I'll describe it here. Spatial is spatially explicit. We want the footprint, we want the polygon associated with a particular treatment or conservation action. Again, we're collecting information at the treatment level, not the project level. For semi-spatial, we're collecting some spatial information to get a general idea of where the action is taking place. So we're asking for what state is this occurring? Perhaps what county this is occurring. Generally, where are you in the biome? Now, we are working with our partners to develop a new reporting unit that we will call a sagebrush reporting unit. And we'll go into more depth on the development of those later in this talk. But this is, again, another unit to kind of help us identify where the actions are taking place relative to the impacts driving habitat loss and degradation. So discussing the activities and the sub-activities, we have 3 or 4 primary activities: sagebrush protection, sagebrush restoration, regulatory mechanisms, and non-regulatory mechanisms. Nested within those 4 are approximately 30 sub-activities, ranging from things like conservation easements, to habitat improvements, to conifer removals, and improved grazing practices. Now, the CED has different workflows for data collection based on the type of activity, and it also has a different workflow dependent on whether the action occurs on public or private lands. For public lands, we're asking for spatially explicit information. Again, what's the footprint? What's the boundary of your treatment? Now, for private lands, we're very sensitive to protecting private landowner location and information. And so we understand that by collecting spatially explicit information on private lands, that information may be compromised. So the CED not only doesn't ask for any personally identifiable information, but we're also developing these units, the aforementioned sagebrush reporting unit, that are large enough to obscure any one private landowner, but it's intended to obscure the private landowner location while being small enough to be still biologically meaningful and useful in analyses. And again, so this is kind of capturing what I just stated, but again, we're wanting to obscure and protect that private landowner location, biologically meaningful. And then the fourth point there is that it covers all lands regardless of jurisdictions. Folks have asked us, are we collecting information on disturbance? And we're not. And the reason is not because we can't, but others are already doing it. So rather than be redundant and ask our partners for information that they're reporting to other tools or databases, we're simply coordinating with and collaborating with our partners to make sure that we have access to information on disturbance so we can look at kind of both sides of the ledger, if you will, the debits plus the credits. However, the primary purpose of the CED is to capture information on the credit side, on the conservation action side. So I'm going to give you an example and walk you through how we're going to collect information on private lands and how we're developing those. All the spatial layers I'm showing you are draft and subject to change. So in the state of Oregon, which is what you're seeing here, we have some reporting units for private lands data collection. These coincide with the Bureau of Land Management's habitat assessment framework. These are what are called, you may have heard of them as fine scale half polygons. Again, you're looking at the black lines that are akin to about a Huck 8 watershed. Now, stakeholders in Oregon have worked together to review those polygons, boundaries, to make sure that they're comfortable with them. Again, they're large enough to obscure private landowner location. They're biologically relevant to sage grouse, and they cover all lands. And so here you're seeing that. And on your next slide, I'd like to draw your attention to where you're seeing white polygons. Those are the private lands. So you'll see in any one of those black polygons, we have enough private lands that no one landowner or two landowners will be identified when conservation actions are summarized by that entire unit. Now that's what's going to be used in the states of Oregon and Idaho. For the other states, we're partnering with the USGS, who is currently developing a set of hierarchical polygons used for tracking population estimates and trends for greater sage grouse. Those polygons are being developed with the states in coordination using state data. So I'm going to provide you just an example for the state of Nevada. So again, here what you'll notice is we've got if you're looking at the three gray figures in the center of the screen, you'll see that we have 7 polygons in the first one, but they can be rolled up from the finer scale to the mid scale. And you'll see approximately how many exist within the state of Nevada. Again, looking at that same example, we've got those 7 units, and here, drawing your eye to the red pixels on the screen, again, you'll see that we not only have enough private land, but enough landowners in each of those polygons to obscure private landowner location and information. If there were any concerns that we did not have enough private land or have enough private landowners within a particular polygon, again, the border between any 2 polygons can be dissolved, making one larger polygon. That's the benefit of having those nested hierarchical clusters. For those of you who are familiar with WAFWA's chat tool, the Crucial Habitat Assessment tool, we've overlaid these 1 square mile hexagons. So it's just intended to give you a frame of reference. We're not using those hexagons, but you can see that we have a considerable amount of acreage an area in any one of those polygons. And again, just another comparison just to kind of give you a feel for how large these areas are. On the left, you'll see the Huck 8 watersheds. And then again, in the center, you'll see the blue lines. We have the Huck watershed along with the 1 square mile hexagons, and then you'll even see we threw in the 7 square mile cogs. And then back to the original. So again, this is a Nevada example, but we will, when the USGS and the states are completed with these LEC clusters, which will likely be later the summer of 2019, we will then adopt those LEC clusters at the level that the states have deemed appropriate. And for the CED's purpose, we'll use them and call them sagebrush reporting units as opposed to LEC clusters, as information summarized in the CED could be used for species other than sage grouse, of course. So we'll pause again there, and this is going to conclude the second of 3 webinars. And in the third webinar, we'll talk more about the reporting as well as the interoperability of the conservation efforts database with other existing databases and decision support tools. So, thanks for your time. Talk soon.